to start? Okay. Always flummoxed by electronics. I'm Sherm Garnett, Dean of Madison College. I want to welcome you to the Jack Painter lecture for this year. Got a couple of things to say about Jack Painter and his legacy before introducing Arthur. I realize as the time goes by, there are fewer and fewer of us, even here at the college, that understand the impact of Professor Painter and Dean Painter on the college. I wanted to say a few things because I think especially for the people who didn't know him, I wanted to convey something of the essence of why this lecture series is so important to us. Jack was really a founder and a statesman in higher education, especially at our college. One of the founders of the program. It seems there's been a lot of change since its founding. There have been a lot of new people added, but the sort of core of it, the idea that public affairs matters, and it matters in a way that one wants to think about issues of justice and inequality, right and wrong, theoretical issues related to the best way of life, politics, and the private sphere. Each of those things, I think, come out of a kind of well, half conspiracy, half conversation of the founding group, who invented different fields of study, which didn't copy the university so much as to try to pull from different parts of disciplines and approaches that created a kind of a lively, serious, intimate education experience that one expects from graduate study, that has come to be a hallmark of our undergraduate program here. So Jack is really one of the founders, not only of the political theory field, which had the much better title of Justice, Morality, and Constitutional Democracy when I was a member of it. We should get t-shirts, Eric, yes. But also animating the discussion on race, urban inequality issues in the United States. He was a very serious and passionate student of the American regime. I think Steve Couts last year talked about that better than I can. But again, this sense of being a partisan of the American regime, but a critic of it, a serious critic of can we do better, animated a whole set of courses that he taught. I took him on constitutional law and on American founding. These were unforgettable classes for me. But also for me, he taught the middle period, the one that Professor Melzer is also interested in, the Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, quite unforgettably as an amazing teacher. I think the last thing that I wanted to say about Jack, too, is his effort to keep the college open. And in this environment, and we just went through a difficult period at Michigan State, there was no question about Madison being an important pillar of that. And while we had to toss in money just like everybody else to meet budget cuts, there was a sense in which we're a permanent part of Michigan State, but that wasn't the case at the end of the 70s when there was a budget downturn. And Jack took the leadership of the college at that time and was certainly one of the key figures, along with some other important people outside the college, and especially even outside the university, of making the argument that this was an experiment that was going to last and had value. And I think in reward for that work, which meant going against a provost, never a great career move, he ended up not being our permanent dean. There's a lot of different stories. I wasn't here. I'm not going to repeat any of them, but I think he certainly was a man that would have led us very well. He certainly led us very well as an acting dean, and he went on to a very distinguished career at the University of Dallas. ending up as provost there, which I don't know if that's a reward or a punishment, the more I see those jobs. But anyway, I did think it's important for those of you in the room who don't know him that this is not an abstract figure or a fat cat or whatever the expression is that somehow we're honoring. It's somebody that's really essential to who we are and who we were and who we will be. And he's very much missed. And in that spirit, we've done a series of these lectures that have focused on all sorts of issues because they reflect Jack Painter's intellectual breadth and depth. And that's what's going to happen today. Arthur Melzer will be speaking on philosophy and secrecy, the forgotten practice of esoteric writing. He too is an outstanding teacher and scholar, someone that we've gotten to know because he teaches nearby at the political science department. PhD from Harvard, first book on Rousseau. Just an amazing teacher of political philosophy. But this project in particular moved me because my background's in Russian literature, and the idea of Aesopic writing or esoteric writing is sort of born into the history of Russian literature and of trying to say what you want to say without the czar finding out, or at least not being punished for it. And I think we were both, in reading Arthur's book, we were both drawn to that essay of Leo Strauss's on persecution in the art of writing. And somewhere in that essay, I still remember he says that everything I'm talking about is somewhere buried in rhetorical manuals of the ancients. And one of those times when I was doing my PhD work, I found some of those things. I tried to share some of them with Arthur, although he knew most of them already. But the Russian stuff, too, I think is a clear example. Current Arabic political culture, there's a lot of cultures on the planet where careful writing is important. But in the widest sense, I think the issue of how knowledge is transmitted, how dangerous is knowledge, how maybe messages can be differentiated between certain kinds of readers. I think we've lost some of that, and I think Arthur's book, for reasons that I suppose Arthur will talk about, but to me, this issue still resonates as a kind of issue about the nature of knowledge, the nature of the modern project, and the sort of earliest conceptions of philosophy or other kinds of wisdom as benign or potentially not democratic. And so it's that I will be an enthusiastic supporter of Arthur's book. It's a wonderful book, and I'm pleased to introduce him today to give his lecture based on that book. So, Professor Melzer.
Good afternoon. Is this miking? Yes, you can hear me? Excuse me. So good afternoon. Dean Garnett, thank you very much for your generous remarks. I do also want to confirm the truth of what he said concerning being a help to me. I would every month or so get an email from him with some obscure nugget, dug up from the letters of Pushkin or obscure works of Boccaccio about my topic, about esoteric writing, which were a great help to me and are all to be found in somewhere in my book and in the appendix online. So I thank him not only for his words today, but for his deeds in the last several years. Let me also just quickly mention that when I came to MSU in 1978, Jack Painter was already here and making his mark. Over time, I came to know him and greatly admire him, if from a certain distance. And I will only add one reflection or fact, and that is that back then, I would have to say that I was also a little scared of Jack. There was an intensity bordering on fierceness in his mind and in his seriousness that intimidated me. but I have pretty much recovered by now. And so I can say that it is with pleasure as well as with a sense of honor that I participate in this wonderful lecture series dedicated to celebrating his memory and his achievement. Now, my talk today, which I fear is a bit overlong, and so at some point I'm going to try and speed up, though I like to speak slowly. My paper comes fully equipped with an epigraph. It's an earthy old Ethiopian proverb, one of the things that Dean Garnett did not supply me with. It goes, "When the great Lord passes by, the wise peasant bows deeply and silently farts." Every subject class has its arts of silent resistance. This is true of peasants. It is even more true of philosophers. That, at any rate, is the thesis of my talk today. We today are all believers in progress. Things tend to improve over time. Yet even we must concede that this is not uniformly the case. The passage of time may bring intellectual advance, but also decline. Discovery, but also ossification, shallowness, and forgetting. There is a natural tendency, however, to notice and to be impressed with the discoveries and to neglect the forgettings. Countless books have been written, countless lectures delivered, celebrating the discovery of some important phenomenon. This lecture is about the forgetting one. In a letter to a friend dated October 20th, 1811, Goethe speaks of an act of forgetting taking place before his eyes. Quote, "I have always considered it a misfortune which became more and more prevalent in the second half of the previous century that one no longer made a distinction between the exoteric and the esoteric," unquote. Goethe reports here an important and well-known phenomenon, that an important and well-known phenomenon has quietly been dropping out of awareness: the philosophic practice of esoteric writing. By this is meant the practice of writing, quote, between the lines, of communicating in hints and riddles, of hiding one's most unorthodox thoughts behind a veneer of conventional pieties for fear of persecution or for other reasons. Goethe's warning about this went unheeded, but it turned out to be remarkably prescient. As I will argue, in the first half of the 19th century, esoteric writing, there's a stiff breeze here. Esoteric writing was very well known, openly discussed, and almost universally practiced, as indeed it had been since ancient times. But in the 19th century, this widespread practice was slowly discontinued, as Goethe is reporting to us, and after that, gradually forgotten, until finally, in the 20th century, it was confidently declared a myth. It never happened. It was rediscovered principally by Leo Strauss, who began publishing on the subject in the late 1930s, but Strauss's warnings, too, went largely unheeded. And it is not altogether hard to understand why. There does seem something a little bit crazy about the idea of esotericism. Is it plausible that a philosopher would choose to obscure his ideas in the very act of communicating them? Furthermore, this alleged practice is plainly dishonest. It is offensively elitist. And in its concern with puzzles and secret codes, it seems built on a childish fascination with buried treasure. It is a practice one might expect from astrologers, mystics, and alchemists, but surely not genuine philosophers. Nonetheless, I will attempt to defend the thesis that esoteric writing was a genuine practice among Western philosophers prior to, say, 1800. Furthermore, it was not at all a rare thing. It was not some kind of idiosyncratic exception. It was the rule, a near constant accompaniment of the philosophic life for 2,000 years. I do not deny that if true, this fact would be very inconvenient for us, since esoteric writing is much more difficult to interpret and understand. Indeed, it can throw the door open to all kinds of interpretive excess and conspiratorial nonsense. But it is important to keep in mind that the question before us is not whether we like this thesis, but whether it is true. And in the next, say, 40 or 50 minutes, I will attempt to convince you that it is. Still, before I get started, it is necessary first to do two things. First, I need to clarify and make more precise the thesis I will be defending. And second, I need to say something about why it matters. Why should you care? So, first, it is necessary to distinguish between two very different questions that one could ask regarding the practice of esotericism. There is, first of all, the historical question. The historical question of whether past philosophers did, in fact, engage in this practice. And then there is the normative and philosophical question of whether they were right, if they did so, whether they were right to do so, and whether, in fact, everyone, ourselves included, ought to write this way too. Now, my talk, as also my book, focuses on the first question, the historical question. My aim is not particularly to get people to like esotericism, still less to practice it. My goal is simply to encourage people to recognize that, like it or not, esotericism happened, that this practice is an historical reality, and what is more, a monumental reality that affects the whole conduct of the intellectual life of the West for 2 millennia. But then we might ask, okay, so why should we care about this? Exactly what is at stake in this historical question of esotericism? Now, part of the answer is obvious. If it turns out to be true that most philosophers of the past routinely hid some of their most important ideas beneath a surface of conventional opinions, then surely we had better know that. If earlier philosophers wrote esoterically and we do not read them esoterically, we will necessarily misunderstand them. We will systematically cut ourselves off from their thought precisely in its most unorthodox, original, and liberating part. But there is also another and even greater harm that might result if esotericism is real and we don't know it. Strange to say, the ignorance of esotericism might lead us to misjudge the whole character of human reason as such. Think about it. When we read an esoteric writer in ignorance of his esotericism, we mistakenly take his surface, his exoteric teaching, for his true one. Now, these surface teachings will of course, vary greatly from one thinker to another, but they will all be the same in one crucial respect. They will all be carefully designed to create the false appearance of conformity to the most powerful dogmas of that thinker's time and place, which it is too dangerous to question openly. It follows that wherever you have a society or a scholarly culture like ours, which for over 2 centuries now has been reading esoteric writers non-esoterically, this is likely to produce a very precise and predictable result. It will give rise in this society to a systematically recurring misimpression. Everywhere they look, the people in this society will see the same thing, the dispiriting spectacle of the human mind vanquished by the ruling ideas of its time. It appears that even our most celebrated geniuses, our Aristotles and our Shakespeares, with all their extraordinary gifts and agonized efforts, always end up just confirming the myths of their local cave. It is difficult to overstate the profound influence of this recurring experience. It forms a crucial but unseen part of the intellectual background of our times, motivating the late modern or postmodern predisposition to the critique and disempowerment of reason. In the age of the forgetfulness of esotericism, our age, it comes to seem obvious to everyone that the human mind is not free, but wholly contextualized, culture-bound, socially determined. And if that is so, then all our truths are just local, accidental, and temporary. Our highest wisdom is only the hometown ethnocentrism polished up. The awareness of esotericism, by contrast, reveals the falseness, the calculated insincerity of this ubiquitous facade of philosophical conformity, which now comes to sight as an ironic and artful act of resistance. Behind this defensive wall, sheltered and encouraged by it, thrives a secret underground of daring and dissent, a freewheeling speakeasy of the mind. In short, the ignorance of esotericism, by blinding us to the hidden world of freedom, keeps us in ignorance of ourselves, of the surprising power and independence of the human mind, of its unsuspected capacity to resist time and place. This, then, is what is at stake in the historical question of esotericism that we are considering. So in the remainder of my talk, I will try to demonstrate the historical reality of esoteric writing, and I will do so by offering 3 different lines of argument or proof. First, I will try to make sense of this strange, even crazy sounding practice by explaining the clear reasons, the powerful motives that compelled philosophers to write this way. Second, I'll try to give you some clear, solid, empirical evidence in the form of historical testimony, showing that moved by these reasons, philosophers did indeed write esoterically. And then thirdly, I will explore the sources of our powerful resistance to this whole idea. Why do we feel in our bones that philosophers could not possibly have engaged in this practice? In short, what are the sources of the great forgetting, of the great denial of esotericism in our time? Okay, so part 1. The motives or theoretical basis of esotericism. What motives or what features of the human condition could have induced so many philosophers over the last 2,000 years, living in vastly different times and places, to all engage in this same strange behavior? Let me first answer in the most concrete way before turning to a deeper and more theoretical answer. Concretely, there is not just one motive for esoteric writing, but rather, I would argue, 4 distinct, if related, motives. First, in virtually all societies prior to 1800, there were strict limits on freedom of thought and speech. And efforts to go beyond these limits were met by persecution. Therefore, the first and the most obvious motive for esotericism is the philosopher's desire to shield himself from persecution by society. I call this defensive esotericism, philosophers defending themselves. Consider, for example, this statement by Diderot appearing in his famous encyclopedia. Quote, "The condition of the philosopher is very dangerous. There is hardly a nation that is not soiled with the blood of several of them. What should one do then? Must one be senseless among the senseless? No, but one must be wise in secret. For most of history, wisdom and secrecy have necessarily gone together for the sake of self-defense. But why, you might ask, have societies been so inclined to persecute philosophy? That leads us eventually to the second point. Virtually all societies prior to 1800 were what we can call traditional societies, which as such were not and did not claim to be based on reason. They were based on inherited traditions, ancestral myths, and customs. And since these societies were not based on reason, they were necessarily threatened and endangered by reason and philosophical rationalism, which might undermine their non-rational basis, their traditions and customs. And since the philosophers knew this, that gave them the second motive for esotericism, namely the desire to shield and protect society from the potentially corrosive effects of their own philosophical rationalism. So I call this protective esotericism. The third motive for esotericism is a pedagogical or educational one. Most philosophers, especially classical philosophers, when they wrote their books, did so primarily for the purpose of converting and educating the few gifted readers who are capable of it, converting them to the philosophic life. And the writers of such books thought that it was essential in this philosophic education and philosophic conversion to employ what today we call the Socratic method. It was crucial, in short, not to spoon-feed the reader and not to give too much away, but rather to leave most of the work to be done by the reader, to make the reader think and to make the reader discover the things that you want him or her to discover. So what becomes necessary for this pedagogical or Socratic purpose is a rhetoric that forces the reader, a rhetoric that presents hints instead of answers. A rhetoric that is coy and riddling and forces the reader to think for him or herself. And so this is the third motive for esotericism and the third kind, which I call pedagogical esotericism. Fourth and finally, some philosophers in writing their books were motivated less by a pedagogical motive, less by the spreading of philosophy to a few potential philosophers out there, and motivated more by a desire to educate and transform society as a whole, to create fundamental change within their society and their culture. Well, to do that, just as in order to educate, you need a certain kind of rhetoric, so similarly, in order to transform not an individual, but a whole society, you need a kind of rhetoric. You need a politically manipulative rhetoric that appeals to the ideas that are powerful in the time and place that you are addressing and somehow moves them in the direction that you want them to go. And in order to do that, it is not always the best thing to do to state explicitly and openly where you want to move them. To use a word that developed later, but is fairly applied to this kind of political ambition in a philosophical book leads to the employment of what we call propaganda. So this is the fourth form of esotericism. I call this political esotericism. So in sum, 4 motives and 4 kinds of esotericism: defensive, protective, pedagogical, and political. But having described esotericism in these 4 distinct forms, one wonders, one wants to see sort of what unifies them all, or one can't sort of dig a little further beneath the surface, get a more fundamental accounting of that. And that's what I want to try and turn to doing now. I want to argue that esotericism in all of its forms is, if you like, a kind of doublespeak. Doublespeak in the sense that within a single text, what it's trying to do is to say 2 different things to 2 different audiences. And on the deepest level, I want to argue, this doublespeak derives from the fundamental dualism of human life itself, the dualism of theory and practice, philosophy and politics. So that's the argument I want to make. To see this, let's briefly begin at the very beginning. We are all human beings here. So what is it that makes us human? According to the well-known answer of Aristotle, man is the rational animal. Now, this famous answer makes a good deal of sense, but it's also obviously incomplete. We do have minds, but we are certainly not pure minds, disembodied minds. That is why the same philosopher also reports with equal sententiousness, man is the political animal. Thus, the full Aristotelian view is that 2 different and potentially rival things make us human: rationality and politicality, or contemplation and citizenship, or the detached quest for theoretical truth and active membership within the moral, political, religious community. We humans are double beings, like centaurs. This strange fact compels us to confront a number of questions. The first and best known is this: if there are 2 parts of us, where then is our perfection and happiness to be found? In the perfection of our rationality, or in the perfection of our politicality? In other words, our underlying dualism is what leads to the famous 2 lives, famous since ancient times, the so-called vita contemplativa, the contemplative life, and the vita activa, the active life, or the political life. So which then is the best? Now, most philosophers, especially in antiquity, answered this question in favor of the philosophical life. But our dualism also necessarily leads to another question, a different question, although it is less familiar to us, because for some reason it is seldom openly raised in modern times. This question is, how do the 2 lives, or the 2 parts of our double humanity, fit together? How does our rationality relate to our sociality? Specifically, do they conflict with each other? Or do they fit together? Are they harmonious? Now, in the earliest stages of human development, it's obvious that these 2 elements depend upon and complement one another. Reason cannot develop and cannot flourish without society. And conversely, political life cannot develop and flourish without reason. But over time, things do not remain the same in this relationship. Reason develops further, ultimately rising, at least in a few rare individuals, to the level of philosophy or rationalism. That is, to the level where reason makes the resolute attempt to break free of all ancestral tradition and social convention and to rely wholly on itself to make sense of the universe without taking anything on faith. And when reason reaches this philosophical level, that is, when the two lives fully emerge, then the earlier harmony between reason and society turns to opposition. For philosophic reason finds its primary obstacle in the fundamental myths and traditions, the ethnocentric conventions of society, and society finds a primary danger in philosophy's subversive drive to question all these things that it is based on. At this stage, then, philosophy appears essentially iconoclastic, antinomian, and unsocial, and society seems fundamentally anti-intellectual or anti-rational. So then the crucial question becomes this: can this relationship change again? Must these two elements of our humanity remain tragically in permanent conflict? Or can this fundamental opposition eventually be overcome, either by some progress in society, or some change in philosophy, or both? Now, broadly speaking, the second view, the harmonist view, that the two elements can return to harmony and unity, that is characteristic of Western thought since the Enlightenment. And the first view, the tragic, conflictual view that the opposition is permanent, is characteristic of classical and, to a large extent, medieval thought as well. Now, clearly a philosopher's position on this central question, a question that I repeat, we almost never formulate very clearly to ourselves. I mean, if you just pick up a text in Introduction to Philosophy, and they'll introduce you to all of the problems of philosophy, this never shows up. But this central question of how the two parts of us fit together, and how the two lives fit together, and how the philosopher and his kind fit in with the rest of society, that will clearly determine any philosopher's stance regarding the act of writing. All the famous books of philosophy lining our shelves were conceived and rhetorically crafted on the basis of some answer to this inescapable question: what is the proper posture of the life of reason what is the proper posture of the life of reason to the life of community and tradition? In other words, how should those who live for truth speak to those who live for something other than the truth? With this in mind, we see the origin and basis of the four variants of esotericism that I began by describing. In the classical and medieval worlds, we find the first three forms of esotericism: defensive, protective, and pedagogical, which all tend to go together because they are just three different consequences of the same basic principle, the classical, conflictual view of theory and practice. If philosophical rationalism is in essential and inescapable tension with the life of the community, then each of these must be shielded from the other, that being best for both. From this arises the twin necessity of defensive esotericism and protective esotericism, the one to shield philosophy from society, the other to shield society from philosophy. And this same conflictual premise also leads to pedagogical esotericism, because the gifted individual's conversion from the active or political life to the philosophic life, that is, from one side of a fundamental opposition to the other, will necessarily involve a difficult rupture that needs to be prepared and managed and smoothed by an artful Socratic rhetoric. So that is how the first three forms of esotericism all stem from the same premise, the first answer to the question of how theory and praxis relate, the conflictual view. Now, the opposite premise, the harmonistic view of theory and practice, has largely characterized Western thought since the Enlightenment, and it has given rise to the fourth form of esotericism, political esotericism. In composing their books, most philosophers in this period were motivated by the belief that philosophy, if properly packaged and disseminated, could slowly but fundamentally transform the political world, bringing it into harmony with reason. That it was possible to rationalize the world. Thus, in the new rational world that they were attempting to create, where the opposition between reason and society would be wholly overcome, there would no longer be a need for esotericism of any kind. However, in order to create that world, they needed temporarily to employ a new, aggressive form of esotericism, what I'm calling political esotericism, which is a politically propagandistic rhetoric needed to give their philosophical writings a new transformative political power. Furthermore, in this transitional period, they would also continue to need defensive esotericism in order to shield them from the persecution that these revolutionary projects would inevitably, but only temporarily, provoke. So in this way, we see that esotericism, in its four forms, is a direct expression of or response to the enduring issue of theory and practice. A philosophic book must necessarily seek to convey two different doctrines at once, because among humans there are fundamentally different lives. There are two fundamentally different lives. Those who live for truth can live and flourish among those who live for tradition, but they must watch carefully what they say. Esotericism is a doublespeak that grows out of the inherent doubleness of human life. So that's my effort to explain why this crazy-sounding procedure of writing esoterically, why that would make sense for philosophers. So we turn to the second part of the second level or kind of proof. If it's become clearer why a philosopher might choose to write esoterically, the question just then becomes, well, okay, but is there any hard evidence that they actually did it? Okay, these motives sound plausible, but lots of things are plausible that aren't real. So did it happen? Now, given the secretive or hidden character of esotericism, one might well ask, how could there be any hard evidence of this practice? But fortunately, it's possible to reply to that objection. It is possible to come up with evidence if the philosophers themselves told us that they practice esotericism, and so they have. One can find clear and explicit statements by past philosophers openly testifying to the existence of esotericism, either in their own works or in those of others. And there are actually not just a few such statements. There are literally hundreds of them, stemming from every period and strain of Western thought, from the ancient Greeks to the 19th century. Since there is no time here to go through a long sampling of this testimony, and it would be unbearably boring if there were, I limit myself to a few telling examples. Let us play this game. Let's try to think of those thinkers who seem the least likely to be esoteric, the toughest cases. Then, if I can produce testimony to their esotericism, that would prove a lot, and prove it with just a few examples. So, want to play? So let's start with the famous encyclopedia, edited by Diderot and D'Alembert. Now, this work is, as most people know, the great flagship of the Enlightenment, the work most resolutely dedicated to overturning prejudice and to spread universally the philosophic truth of things. What could be more anti-esoteric than that? But we have actually already seen a statement from the encyclopedia by Diderot himself, advising philosophers to be wise in secret, or at least to acknowledge that that has, through most of history, been necessary. And beyond this particular article that I've quoted from, the encyclopedia actually makes mention of esotericism in over 25 other articles by many different authors. Indeed, the encyclopedia actually contained an article on the subject of esotericism, bearing the title Exoteric and Esoteric. And it states, quote, the ancient philosophers had a double doctrine, the one external, public or exoteric, the other internal, secret or esoteric. But more than that, the encyclopedia not only speaks about esoteric writing and not only praises it, but also systematically engages in it, as is made clear in a long article written by Diderot himself and entitled Encyclopedia. So in the encyclopedia, there was an article called Encyclopedia. So it's a kind of selfie. And in this article, he states shockingly openly that in the work of the encyclopedia, he seeks, quote, to secretly attack, unsettle, and overturn certain ridiculous opinions which one would not dare to insult openly. And the basic technique for doing this is that in all of the major articles, with major titles like Bible, or Jesus or whatever, in all of those you just present the conventional view. But somewhere or other, when you make something, there'll be a little also, see also. There'll be see alsos in the encyclopedia, yeah? And that seems so innocuous, if not, boring, Somehow your mind goes to sleep when the see also, right? But see also is the key to the encyclopedia, he says. He says this explicitly. Because it sends you to some obscure article on something that nobody's ever heard of, where the author undoes all the harm done in the major article and actually presents a contrary view. So it's really quite shocking how openly, in that article, Diderot reveals that the encyclopedia itself is written esoterically and even tells you a bit about the technique used. So here in the encyclopedia, perhaps the least likely place in the world, we see an explicit, open, unmistakable embrace of esotericism. But somebody might say, well, here's a still tougher case. What about Rousseau? Because Rousseau is, esotericism is dishonest, right? I mean, it's sneaky. It's playing games with the truth. And Rousseau is the great scourge of hypocrisy and phoniness. He is the modern saint of sincerity and authenticity, speaking from the heart. And he's also the great champion of equality and the enemy of every form of elitism. So, what about Rousseau? Did he write with secret hidden messages for the chosen few? Well, here's Rousseau telling us telling us how he wrote his first writing, the first discourse. Quote, "It was always for few readers that I developed my ideas. Often, most of my readers must have found my discourses badly connected and almost entirely rambling for lack of perceiving the trunk of which I showed them only the branches. So he's concealed something. He's concealed the trunk and just shown the branches, and leaves it to the reader to figure out what's the trunk that's connecting all of these branches. So they see it as disconnected and rambling because they do not perceive the trunk of which I showed them only the branches. But that was enough for those who know how to understand, and I never wanted to speak to the others. So this is a pretty open and clear statement of esotericism, and gives you some of the feel for it as well. And elsewhere, Rousseau makes clear that he was not alone in writing esoterically. He speaks of, quote, the distinction between the two doctrines so eagerly received by all the philosophers, and by which they professed in secret sentiments contrary to those they taught publicly. So much for Rousseau. Well, then, who else couldn't possibly have been writing esoterically? What about the earnest and saintly Thomas Aquinas? Okay? Come on, he's not fooling around. He wouldn't condone the use of these literary games of hide and seek. But then listen, quote, certain things can be explained to the wise in private, which we should keep silent about in public. Therefore, these matters should be concealed with obscure language, so that they will benefit the wise who understand them and be hidden from the uneducated who are unable to grasp them. All right, so what about St. Augustine, right? In the whole tradition of philosophy, with the possible exception of Kant, there's one thinker who stands out as the greatest hater of lying, and that's St. Augustine. So what does St. Augustine think about esotericism? Well, he declares that the pure stream of philosophy, that's his term, should be, quote, guided through shady and thorny thickets for the possession of the few, rather than allowed to wander through open spaces where cattle, that means the common herd, break through, and where it is impossible for it to be kept clear and pure. I think that method or art of concealing the truth is a useful invention. Let us turn lastly to Greek antiquity. First, Plato, who I include here, not because he's a hard case, because I think he's so playful and wild that people have always suspected stuff's going on. I mean, he's playing around one way or another. But I include him just because of his importance. Here we have the testimony of Diogenes Laertius, an ancient writer who wrote a sort of history of philosophy. He writes, quote, Plato has employed a variety of terms in order to make his system less intelligible to the ignorant, unquote. And similarly, the 10th century Islamic philosopher Al-Farabi states in his commentary on Plato's laws, quote, the wise Plato did not feel free to reveal and uncover the sciences for all men. Therefore, he followed the practice of using symbols, riddles, obscurity, and difficulty, so that science would not fall into the hands of those who would not deserve it and be deformed, or into the hands of one who does not know its worth or who uses it improperly. In this, he was right. So that quotation is a twofer. Right? It's about Plato, but it also shows that Al-Farabi himself agrees with this practice. Well, let's take one last stab at finding somebody who wasn't esoteric. Aristotle. You could make a case that of all thinkers, there's some way in which he seems to be the least esoteric, because unlike the playful Plato, Aristotle is so straight, so literal-minded, so eager at every point to be clear, precise, and methodical at all times, that the claims of his esotericism seem utterly absurd. Yet, in fact, there is more testimony to his esotericism than to that of any other philosopher. ancient or modern. Simplicius, for example, which is one of Aristotle's ancient commentators, remarks that in many of Aristotle's works he, quote, deliberately introduced obscurity, repelling by this means those who are too easygoing, unquote. And Plutarch reports the same thing. In fact, Aristotle became so well known in the ancient world for his esotericism that this trait is identified as one of his most distinctive characteristics by the Greek satirist Lucian, a writer of the 2nd century AD. Lucian, in his comic dialogue, The Sale of Lives, depicts a slave auction of philosophers, arranged by Zeus, with Hermes as the auctioneer. So we pick up the action after the sale of Pythagoras, Heraclitus, and some other philosophers, and they finally put Aristotle on the block. Hermes, come now, by the height of intelligence, the one who knows absolutely everything. Buyer, what's he like? Hermes, moderate, gentlemanly, adaptable in his way of living, and what is more, he's double. Buyer, what do you mean? Hermes, well, viewed from the outside, he seems to be one man, and from the inside, another. So if you buy him, be sure to call the one self exoteric and the other esoteric. So much for Aristotle. Now, this is just a tiny sampling of the testimonial evidence to esotericism that can be found if you just read around with an open mind. And as I'm arguing, I think it proves a lot, since I do think that these are pretty much the hardest cases. If these people are writing esoterically, anybody could be writing esoteric. Doesn't mean that they were. You just have to see the testimony there too. But it makes it much more likely and more plausible. If you're interested in seeing all of the testimony, this is conveniently gathered. Not only, well, it's not all in my book, but there's an appendix online where I just gather all the testimony in chronological order. It runs to about 100 pages, and you can find it if you just Google Melzer, appendix. That will not take you to a YouTube home video of my appendectomy, but rather to the appendix. If you want to see the appendectomy, you have to say Melzer, appendectomy.
Karl Marx for $10.
No, I didn't say. I said before 1800. Sit down. But I will say, he certainly is propagandistic. And in that sense, he does practice political esotericism. That would be one point. Second point is he believes in esoteric. He believes in esotericism in the sense that he thinks that earlier thinkers did write esoterically. Interestingly enough, he thinks that Adam Smith was esoteric. And in his interpretation of Smith in Capital, there are about 4 or 5 places where he says, well, here Smith is being exoteric. So take that. Okay, now I have to concede, of course, that there are serious objections that could be made to this kind of evidence. These are, after all, just bare quotations that I've been reading, and in my appendix as well, and in the book, I use a lot of, quotations just ripped out of context. And there could obviously be significant problems of context, of translation, of interpretation, even of authenticity. That's all true enough. But in the full compilation of quotations, the numbers are sufficiently large, many hundreds, so that even if a scrupulous analysis should lead one to eliminate, to take the extreme case, say fully half of the testimony, owing to problems of translation or context or whatever, still the remaining evidence would be more than sufficient to show that esotericism was a very real, widely practiced, and frequently discussed phenomenon. Also, another very striking fact about this testimony is its universality. That is to say, this kind of testimony shows up everywhere. It's not just confined to some little corner here and there of Western history. It's there in 5th century Athens and 1st century Rome, 4th century Algeria, 12th century Cordoba, 13th century Paris, 16th century Florence, 17th century Amsterdam, 18th century London. It's there among the pagans, the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims. It's found with the Platonists and the Aristotelians, the Stoics and the Epicureans, the nominalists and the realists, the mystics and the materialists. It is, in fact, difficult to name a single major philosopher from any time or place before 1800 who did not somewhere make open and approving reference to this practice, either regarding his own writings or those of others. It is hard to see what further reasonable objections could be raised against the testimonial evidence for esotericism. There are, to be sure, no absolute certainties here, but that was never to be expected. The issue has always been, is the evidence for esotericism stronger than the evidence against it? So let us now turn with resolute even-handedness to consider the other side. Let us ask the skeptic to present the philosophical testimony denying the existence of esotericism and replying to all of these assertions that it exists. But the answer is that there is almost no such testimony, almost none at all. All of the massive philosophical testimony to the existence of esotericism throughout history stands almost completely uncontradicted and uncontested. To be sure, throughout history, there have been plenty of disputes on the subject of esotericism. There are disagreements about the proper technique for interpreting a given esoteric writer. There are debates about what has been the primary motive throughout history causing thinkers to write esoterically. There are debates about the advisability of esotericism. But prior to our period, by which I mean sort of late, beginning in the 1800s at some point, prior to that anti-esoteric period, there is virtually no evidence of the outright denial of the existence of esotericism. So in sum, the combination of three striking features make this empirical testimonial evidence to esotericism peculiarly powerful. It is massive in extent, universal in distribution, and virtually uncontradicted. As soon as I replenish my drink, I'll go to part 3. Part 3, objections, resistance, and forgetting. So far, I've presented empirical evidence, explicit testimonial reports, for the existence of esoteric writing, and I've also tried to make sense of these reports by explaining the motives and the underlying theoretical basis for this reported behavior. In this, the final part of my talk, I turn just to consider some objections that you may have to my argument. But beyond mere objections, I want to consider the broader cultural resistance and blindness to esotericism that seems to characterize modern culture in the last century and a half. I want to try to understand that slow process of the forgetting or denial of esotericism that Goethe already discerned in 1811. Now, just to be clear, the question before us is not, why do people today no longer write esoterically? That would not be hard to explain. For example, there's a lot less persecution. The question is, why do we today insist that others in the past did not write esoterically? Why are we in denial about the massive historical fact of esotericism? I think the answer is complex, with many different causes at work. In general, it seems to me that this practice of esotericism violates almost every single major value that we hold dear in the modern world. And so, it's kind of, to some extent, overdetermined, the question of why we resist this. We don't want to believe that these philosophers that we admire would do this thing. So I will address some of these objections in what follows. Perhaps the most obvious thing that causes people today to disbelieve in the historical reality of esotericism is its snooty, almost cartoonish elitism. When it is gravely explained that an esoteric book is one written to secretly address the few or the wise, while excluding the many or the vulgar, who today can bear such talk? We live in a democratic age and view the world through an egalitarian lens. In such democratic times, as Tocqueville points out, the general idea that any man whatsoever, excuse me, this is a quotation from Tocqueville, quote, the general idea that any man whatsoever can attain an intellectual superiority beyond the reach of the rest is soon cast in doubt, unquote. Thus, we naturally incline to dismiss the whole theory of esotericism as impossibly arrogant and elitist. But aren't we committing an anachronistic fallacy in this argument? After all, only a few short centuries ago, all the world was ruled by monarchs and aristocrats. Most of the philosophers, too, held that the best form of government was some form of aristocracy. In these ages, a sense of rank and inequality suffused every aspect of life. Thus, it is oddly anachronistic to think that this earlier world, exquisitely elitist, would, like us, have recoiled in egalitarian horror at the idea of esotericism. Like it or not, through 9/10 of history, people did not think as we do, but rather more as Nietzsche does in the following proudly inegalitarian aphorism. The title of the aphorism is On the Question of Being Understandable. One does not only wish to be understood when one writes. One wishes just as surely not to be understood. It is not by any means necessarily an objection to a book when anyone finds it impossible to understand. Perhaps that was part of the author's intention. He did not want to be understood by just anybody. All the nobler spirits and tastes select their audiences when they wish to communicate, and choosing that, one at the same time erects barriers against the others. Still another reason, a second, why the theory of esotericism strikes us as manifestly improbable is that it involves attributing to the grand and serious thinkers of the past behavior that is secretive and mystery-mongering. And such behavior strikes us as both immoral and childish. And therefore, the whole idea seems implausible in the extreme. But again, this objection presupposes that earlier ages viewed the phenomena of secrecy and reserve in essentially the same way that we do. And that is, again, a very unhistorical assumption. We inhabit a very unique world. We live in and cherish the open society, a sincerity culture where people disclose their hearts to strangers on a plane or on live television, to say nothing of Facebook. We enthusiastically celebrate openness, partly as confession, partly as exhibitionism, full of strange hopes that it will grant us healing and connection. But as soon as one looks beyond the narrow borders of our ultra-modern liberal democratic universe, one finds a world that is steeped in secrecy, that honors reserve and inwardness. It is almost beyond our capacity to understand that, for example, in many earlier societies, indeed in much of contemporary India and Japan, husbands and wives, parents and children can pass their whole lives without ever once openly saying, "I love you." Thus, with the issue of secrecy, just as with the issue of elitism, our own feelings and our own reactions form a surprisingly poor guide to the feelings and the behavior of earlier generations. Third issue. We incline to deny the reality of esotericism also for this reason. It is fundamentally dishonest. Is it really believable that the greatest truth seekers in history were in actuality all bald-faced liars? This is clearly the most disturbing challenge to esotericism. But it's fairly easy to show that a very large and wide-ranging group of earlier thinkers regarded the use of salutary lies, or at least of concealment of some portion of the truth, as legitimate under the right circumstances. I confine myself to a few choice examples. For starters, the position of Plato on the propriety of noble lies is, of course, well known. And, of course, Socrates was famous for his dissimulation and irony. In the modern period, David Hume, pulling no punches, writes, quote, "It is putting too great a respect on the vulgar and on their superstitions to pique oneself on sincerity with regard to them. Did ever one make it a point of honor to speak truth to children and madmen?" Unquote. Similarly, back to the encyclopedia, there's an article by, again, Diderot himself that defends the thesis, quote, "The wise maxim," it defends, quote, "the wise maxim that the lie that procures good is worth more than the truth that causes harm." But cutting again to the bottom line, we have already seen that St. Augustine, the greatest philosophic critic of lying, praises esoteric writing. A fourth factor in our denial of esotericism is this. We strongly doubt that esoteric communication could really work, that people would ever successfully figure out what an esoteric writer is saying. We feel this way, I suggest, because for a variety of reasons, we live in an age of extreme hermeneutical pessimism. We despair of the possibility of reaching the true interpretation of even the simplest of texts. Indeed, that very expression I just used, quote, "the true interpretation," unquote, catches in our ears as the unmistakable sign of naive and benighted thinking. With such a pessimistic mindset, the idea of esoteric communication naturally strikes us as a pure impossibility. But I would cautiously suggest that this despairing reaction may reveal more about ourselves than about esotericism. Because esoteric communication did happen. It went on for over 20 centuries in the West. And while no one would deny that it makes interpretation much more difficult, I am not aware of any writer in this whole period who thought it was impossible or so difficult as to be pointless. Thus, perhaps the newly rediscovered reality of esotericism will cause us to finally question the appropriateness of our hermeneutical pessimism and to realize that our powers of communication and interpretation may well be far greater than is commonly supposed today. There are lots more of reasons why we doubt the reality of esotericism, but let me finally conclude by jumping to one more, let me try and state briefly what I think is the deepest reason for our resistance to esotericism and for our forgetting. We reject, I've argued in the earlier section, first section, that esotericism is, especially of the classical kind, is based on the premise that there is a flaw in the human condition, if you like, that we are two things. We are rational and we are political, and that those two things are in tension with one another. So we are rather poorly put together. And what I want to argue is that the fundamental The deepest reason for our resistance to esotericism is that we reject that tragic vision of the world. We reject the fundamental premise of classical esotericism, the conflictual view of theory and practice. The very idea that life could have an incurable problem at its core, that the two essential elements of our nature, rationality and sociality, could be permanently at war, this strikes people today as simply too tragically disordered to be true. And this rejection is not some idle inclination or quirk, but rather it is something that comes from the deepest levels of modern thought. The modern mind, fast within its humanistic worldview, famously lacks a sense of tragedy and powerfully resists the thought that life could be fundamentally flawed in any way. We are humanists, progressivists, which is to say cheerful solutionists. We believe, or rather insist, that life contains no essential problem that we humans cannot eventually cure. That's a crucial premise of modern living. And we believe this because it is the precondition of our confident thisworldliness, our certainty that there is no fundamental need for God. Thus, we moderns are profoundly resistant to the older, more pessimistic and conflictual understanding of human duality that stands at the heart of classical esotericism. Well, I've tried in this too long but still too brief lecture to give you some solid reasons for suspecting that the phenomenon of philosophical esotericism is indeed real, and that our centuries-long tendency to dismiss it and forget it is profoundly mistaken. I do not know if I have succeeded, but I would like to know. So I'm hoping that in the time remaining to us, we can have some question and answer, and you can tell me if you're persuaded. Thank you. So I think I'm left here to field my own questions. Yes, sir.
You mentioned so modern day, example of very private, that's one right there, science.
Well, I've been arguing that when it comes to at least philosophical writers in the Western tradition, this is a practice that sort of more or less died out starting around 1800, so that it reached a point where the whole thing had been forgotten and then indignantly denied. So I don't think that if we're looking at, sort of famous philosophers, I'm not sure that there are any. There are things sort of on the way. There are various things that, little omissions that a philosopher might here or there have made, or a little, playing a little bit, trying to make things look a little prettier than they are here and there. In my book, I give an example that it turns out that the philosopher John Rawls, if you've read his Theory of Justice, you know that he spends a lot of time referring to Kant. He acknowledges that Kant had a great influence on him. But there's virtually no mention of Hegel. I mean, the name is dropped in a few occasions, but not in a substantive way. Well, so research has now come to light that he had some earlier lectures that he had given on Kant and Hegel, and it turned out that he was very interested in Hegel, and not only that, but that a lot of the sort of essential theses of his theory came out of an interaction with Hegel. And what this person was proposing in this research is that at the time he's writing, in like early 70s, Hegel is just regarded as, a devil in American analytic philosophy departments. And even though John Rawls is already, tenured at Harvard, he obviously figured, well, no need to bring that in. So that's it's fairly trivial, not completely trivial. I don't know if it completely rises to the level of esotericism. It's sort of a good step on the way. But in general, with the decline of persecution and the rise of this belief in the harmony of truth and society that characterizes most modern thinking, it's not a widespread practice. I mean, I guess the clearest example, though, to give you an answer or a name would be Nietzsche. So Nietzsche talks about this practice and does claim at certain points to be practicing it. But if we look beyond philosophical writers to political writers, and if we look beyond the United States, for example, to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, then you find plenty of writers. In fact, if you look at tyrannical regimes around the globe, if you look in Burma, if you look in South Africa under apartheid, Egypt under Mubarak, it's easy to find discussions in newspapers, in magazines, in articles, and so on, of this practice. So to give you, you said you wanted a name. Well, so Václav Havel, okay, the Czech writer and eventually president, he states explicitly in the preface to the Letters to Olga that he wrote it esoterically because he wrote it in jail. So now I'm naming names. Yeah. Is there anybody other than Zinman? Yes, let's go to the back to Fram in the back. That's almost as bad as Zinman. You're on your way, young man.
Oh.
Yes. This is
high praise. High praise indeed. Well, I don't think I'll live up to that here, but I guess I'm very persuaded. You asked if we were persuaded, so I thought I would tell you.
Thank you.
I'm very persuaded of part of the thesis anyway. That is, there's lots of evidence that lots of people thought there was esotericism, and there's every reason to believe that persecution is a good reason for esotericism, and that these things probably go together. So when it comes to doctrines about the immortality of the soul, the nature of the gods, things that have religious bearing of that sort, things that we know Socrates was, for instance, put on trial for, that all seems pretty clear and reasonable and likely. What seems more controversial is to talk about the pedagogical motive, maybe, or the protection of society. So I guess I'll just say two things. One, you have an account of why there would be two motives that have different bearing on the relationship between theory and practice. But it's sort of strange, right? That on the one hand, philosophers have been esoteric because they wanted to corrupt society. And on the other hand, philosophers have been esoteric because they wanted to protect society. You have an account of that, but it does, at the same time, it just seems slightly odd that both of those things would be happening. And that related to that, I guess, is the question of the pedagogical motive. So to go to the ancients, can you say more, I guess, about why they thought it was? I mean, yeah, why it was so why they would concern themselves so much with protecting society, or what's good about being confined to your traditional prejudices?
That's not pedagogical esotericism. That's protective, right?
Right.
Pedagogical esotericism
right.
is
Right.
speaking in hints and so on in order to encourage not the whole society, but certain gifted individuals to, eventually make their way to becoming philosophers themselves. That's what I mean by pedagogical esotericism. But what you're describing sounds more like protective. when you're protecting society in general from the harmful, corrosive effects of your philosophical rationalism.
Right. So I guess I want to ask about both those things. Other than what are those? Can you spell out a little more? What are those harmful, corrosive effects, and why they are worse than for the society, the other people, to just continue to live in ignorance? And then on the pedagogical level, why again is it again a positive good in these thinkers' theory to be obscure and to make it difficult for even the best students to learn? Is it primarily a sorting device, or is it actually a positive good to be unclear?
Okay, so you're asking then, basically, of the four types of esotericism that I described, you got no problem with one of them, which is defensive, protecting yourself against persecution. But you have questions regarding the pedagogical motive on the one hand, and secondly, the protective one, especially since that seems to be protecting society from the rationalism that political esotericism is trying to promote. Okay, so and how does that work? Okay, so let's start with pedagogical. And I mean, it seems like a very alien idea to our contemporaries, but there's very easy entree into that thought, that you need to have some kind of esotericism to be pedagogically effective. And that's pretty much everybody today praises the Socratic method, what's called today the Socratic method. Everybody knows that if you want to be an effective teacher, you don't tell everybody the answers right away. You sort of ask them questions, and then you lead them on, and you're maybe leading questions, and you give them little hints and so on. You get them to see what's wrong with the answer that they themselves have given. And so you get them to think for themselves and discover for themselves. And I've never met anybody who doesn't think that's a good idea, right? So if we can all agree to that, yourself included, then you're already 3/4 of the way there. So that means Socratic method means being obscure, or at least not telling the truth right out there, but being coy and leading with your questions, being a little manipulative in running the discussion and so on, in order to shape it and push it in a certain direction. But you don't want to. You want to do it behind the scenes. You want them, the students, to get there, right? So that seems to me pretty non-controversial. I mean, just people don't like to then formulate that formally with, okay, so then write esoterically, and then say, what? Esotericism. So, but that just seems to me almost as much a no-brainer as the persecution use of esotericism. Now, the only thing I would add to that is that I think that there was a greater belief in the importance of this kind of pedagogical rhetoric in classical medieval times than in modern, for this reason, that everybody agrees you need to use the Socratic method in certain fields, but not necessarily in others. So if you're teaching a class on math, by and large, math teachers just get up there and do the proof, right? They just show you. Even there, they want you to think for yourself, but they figure, well, you'll think for yourself enough in just trying to follow me. So nobody particularly talks about Socratic method in math. But if it's English or comparative literature or philosophy, then people do tend to think that, yeah, you need the Socratic method. But even there, it depends on how you understand, let's stick to philosophy, how you understand philosophy. Now, modern philosophy tries as much as possible to be like math, right? It tries. I mean, philosophy is a field that's half like math and half like English, okay? Ideas about life, but also it aims for a precision where precision is possible and appropriate. So the whole modern effort in philosophies, since Descartes, has been to try and turn philosophy, make it as scientific and mathematical as possible, rigorous as possible, and so on. Get systems of philosophy and so on. Well, to the extent that philosophy moves in that direction, then the Socratic method becomes less important, because now you've got something that it's just crunching the numbers, crunching the ideas, so to speak. Yeah. So just as you don't need a Socratic method in a math class, the more philosophy moves towards system philosophy and rigorous, analytical philosophy, the less you need Socratic method. But the ancients, were less tempted by that mathematical temptation. We're a very technocratic society, and we try and turn everything into a science and a math, right? Ancients weren't into that. Much more open to the difference between philosophy and the knowledge it seeks, especially political philosophy and the knowledge it seeks, and the sciences or math or the arts and so on. And furthermore, the ancient view of philosophy is not that it's just a subject matter or a doctrine, but that it's a way of life. And that converting somebody, and I used that word intentionally, educating to philosophy is converting to philosophy. It's a different way of life. It means leaving your old way of life behind and realizing that your old way of life was mistaken, was based on illusions, and that this is a better, and truer and realer way of life. And anytime you're trying to change somebody's way of life, there especially, you need the Socratic method, okay? Because nobody changed someone's way of life from the outside. You change someone's way of life by somehow nudging them in the right way so that they move themselves, out of where they are and into this new way of life. It's like converting somebody to religion or to Buddhism or something. It's all got to be done from inside. And so, to the extent that philosophy is understood in that way, which is much more common in the ancient world, you get a double emphasis on this need for a kind of Socratic method. Okay? So are we good now on that part? Should I move on? Okay. So, now I liked your formulation about how protective esotericism, trying to shield society from dangerous truths, is in a way the opposite of political esotericism. And that is true, and that's why you can't be both. You can be doing one kind or the other kind for the most part. But people don't do both. By and large, what came first among the ancients is this protective esotericism. They said, look, these truths that we live for are not for everybody. It's a very different way of life. Most people are not capable of living on that level and in that way. Most people have to live and should live according to the ways and the customs of their fathers and their grandfathers and so on. And that's good. Let's leave them untroubled in their old ancestral practices. And so we are going to be protecting them in not telling them what we think. And they do that because they think there's no overcoming that gulf. You can't make everybody into a philosopher. There still have to be, peasants and shoemakers and so on. And, now, in the Enlightenment world, increasingly, there grows the idea that, no, you can change this situation. I mean, the Enlightenment thinkers agree on what the situation was in the ancient world, and they agree that it's still that way in their time, that there are customs and traditions and so on that society is based on. The big difference is that they think it can change, that a wholly different kind of society is possible. Not just that you would get a different king, or maybe instead of a kingship, you'd have a republic. No, not just these, tinkering changes, but that you could have a different kind of society entirely, where it's no longer based on custom and tradition and habit and doing what we've always done. It could be based on reason. And usually what's meant by reason is something not necessarily the same as what ancient thinkers thought was rational, but the modern thinkers thought that, a certain kind of rational pursuit of wealth, for example, security and wealth, that's what everybody should be doing, and that in the right system that we can set up, everybody's interests will fit together. So you could build a society not on custom and tradition and religion, but on self-interest rightly understood, to take Tocqueville's term. Well, if you can build society on self-interest rightly understood, and that means rationally understood, well, then you're building a different kind of society entirely, and one in which truth and rationality is no longer a danger to society, it's the basis of society. So, from that standpoint, if you're using esotericism, it's to try and produce that new society, and your esotericism is all in the name of subverting the customary world, and slowly, in a managed way, but you're trying slowly, carefully to subvert and destroy the old society and build a new one on its ruins. So and that's the purpose of your rhetoric and of your writing, and to some extent of esotericism. You have to do it secretly because you can't do it too openly, both because you'll get killed and also because you don't want it to happen too quickly. You want it to be gradual enough so as to not create chaos. So that means that the modern thinkers would hardly agree with what you said. Yeah, what we're doing with our esotericism is the very opposite of what the ancients were doing with theirs. They were using esotericism to preserve the customary world. We're using ours to gradually, carefully subvert it in order to bring about a better world. So there's no contradiction there. I mean, they're just two different kinds of esotericism based on two very different visions of what the world can and should be like. So how's that working for you? Okay. Yes.
How do you suggest that we approach writing? How do you suggest that we approach writing that we believe may be esoteric?
Okay, good, and it's a good use of the word "may" because it's rarely up in lights. Hey, folks, I'm writing esoterically here. There are some writers who do that, like Maimonides. He says very explicitly he's writing esoterically. And there's no contradiction in being esoteric and telling people that you are. What would be a contradiction is if you're being esoteric and you're telling everybody what the thing you're hiding is. That would be a contradiction. But to say I'm hiding something, but not telling people what it is, there's no contradiction there. So some thinkers, for one reason or another, choose to openly declare that they're writing esoterically. For example, perhaps they're worried that if they don't do that, people won't catch on that they're writing esoterically. They won't read them in the right way. And so they want to help that process along a little bit, so they say, by the way, I'm writing esoterically. So sometimes, as I say, a writer declares that they're esoteric. Most of the time, not. And I do have a chapter in my book, Chapter 9, A Beginner's Guide to Esoteric Reading. And there's a section that says, you can read esoterically. I recommend that to you. But very briefly, I'm not in favor of rushing into an esoteric reading. Esotericism is a dangerous thing. Esoteric reading, it can lead to a great deal of nonsense. So it's not for kids, not for children. And you've got to handle it with some respect and caution. And so I don't think that, your first reading of a book, like, I don't know, suppose you want to read Rousseau. So I would say start reading Rousseau or whoever non-esoterically. Read the writer literally. okay? Try and understand what they're saying, on the surface of their book. And try and try and try. And that, these are hard thinkers, and so you need to read them 2, 3, 4 times, okay? Try and get a grip on what they are saying on the surface. Then, if after all that effort, and you'll learn a lot that way, because it's not like everything they say is false, everything's a trick. No. So you'll learn a lot that way, but at a certain point, you'll see there are certain problems in the text that, despite all your efforts at figuring out what they mean, it just doesn't, it seems to be a flat contradiction or a flaw in the argument or something like that, but of a kind that you suspect they would have to know. And then when you've collected enough of that, then and only then you have a right to go beneath the surface and say, let me see if I can't now read them esoterically and see if, guided by these flaws on the surface that the author has put there as signposts to me, see if I can't, dig deeper and get to an esoteric interpretation. So my first bit of esoteric advice is sort of easy does it. And you definitely need a real, genuine mastery of the text, the literal text, before you are equipped to read esoterically and before you really have the right to read esoteric.
Let me do one more, and then we will.
All right. Should we risk the guy in the purple sweater?
He's got dinner time, but okay.
Make it short, Dick.
But you want to do this first, and then.
Oh, we're skipping it. Okay. All right.
You were just talking about the danger of esoteric writing and how the practice of esoteric writing had been for so long forgotten. So is there a politically esoteric motive for its recovery, or is it just like a historical and academic documentation?
You mean, why have I written this book?
Well, yeah, Dean Garnett mentioned Leo Strauss uncovering esoteric writing as a big part of his work, obviously.
Okay, well, first let me just speak about myself. And I don't think that there's any particular political payoff, any kind of immediate political payoff. It's not like you read all of these esoteric writings through the ages and it comes out that they're all saying the same thing: invade Iraq. Yeah? It's not like that. It's mainly because the main payoff is intellectual. I mean, if you're interested in philosophy, then the first thing you got to figure out is, well, should I read other books or should I just think myself? Then most people realize, well, I'm pretty smart. I can think myself, but it'd be better. A lot of other people are smart and thought about these things before. Let me see what they thought. And then you could say, well, maybe I'll just limit myself to contemporary writers. But we all know that, it's important to think outside the box, especially philosophically. And so everybody in your time and place is in some ways in the same box. So let's look at some other boxes, some other times and some other places. And besides, in philosophy, it turns out that sort of genius matters. Some fields, just hard work matter. It's crucial. Maybe you don't have to be a genius to be a good scholar. You just have to work hard. But to be a philosopher, the questions are so hard and so deep that a certain kind of strength of mind and strength of character and soul is necessary to sort of, scale that mountain. And so there aren't that many of those geniuses around, and so we better take all of them we can find, no matter where they live and when they wrote. So my advice is, do a lot of reading of books from the past. Now, once you've decided to read books from the past, then you got to say, okay, in order to read these books, I want to understand them, and to understand them, you got to know how they're written, and if they're written esoterically, I want to read them esoterically. So that's the first and the simplest and sufficient answer to why this is important and why I'm concerned with it. There is a further aspect to it, and that is what I spoke about at the beginning about this question of if you don't, that there's a certain distortion to our philosophical thinking, in my view, that's come into the modern world because we've been reading esoteric philosophers non-esoterically for 150 years. And that the main consequence of that has been that we have vastly overestimated how much a prisoner each thinker is to his times. And that has led us to all kinds of theories of human reason and human writing and so on that tend to be rather sort of debunking and disempowering. And so, and the word that I would use to describe that general tendency is historicism. This belief, this hyper-contextualism. Everything is determined by its context. So I think that that's a mistake, a big, philosophical wrong path that we've been on for about a century and a half. So that would be another thing that recovering esotericism does. It helps to fight off that illness. So that would be my second motive. Now, then you ask about Strauss. I would basically, as best I can tell, his motives are exactly the same. Strauss was a political philosopher, but he really, when he spoke about political philosophy, the emphasis was on the word philosophy, not on the word political. Political philosophy, in his view, is a kind of stepping stone to philosophy. And it's a long story of why you need this ladder or stepping stone of political philosophy first. But you got to know yourself before you can think straight, something like that. And to know yourself, you need political philosophy. So he's not a very political thinker, in my view. That is to say, he's not motivated by wanting to change the political world. He's got political opinions for sure, and they tended to be very conservative. That's not what that's not what his books are really about. His books are about recovering philosophy. That's what he really cared about. And so, there are a lot of theories out there that that all this esotericism was for the sake of some kind of political agenda, invading Iraq, as I was alluding to a minute ago, or other things, Some people think he's like a Jewish fascist, and so on. And I think all of that is pretty false, but even if it were true, it wouldn't matter because that's not what his books are about. And even if it were true, even if if there were irrefutable evidence that he was a Nazi that comes to light tomorrow, everything that he's discovered about esotericism would still be true. So that's what matters. But anyway, no, I think that his motives are sort of pretty much what I just said or mine. Did I answer your question? Good. All right.
So, Arthur, thank you so much. We have a tradition. Here of a present that we come up with, which is a part of the alumni chapel window that celebrates Abraham Lincoln's Memorial Act. We've used it for the last several years, and I wanted to thank you so much for the lecture and to award this to you.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
So you hang around a bit.
Sure.
But please, thank you so much for coming.